Welcome to Soothing Stories. Tonight, settle in and let the world outside grow quiet. This is a story about the Bermuda Triangle, fact and fiction. There is nothing you need to do now but listen and breathe. Let the words carry you gently into rest. The water is very still tonight. You are somewhere above the Atlantic Ocean, suspended between the amber last light of the western horizon and the first pale stars emerging over the east, a deep blue hour when the sea below looks not like water at all but like hammered pewter, flat and ancient and perfectly calm. The air smells of salt and something older, something mineral and fathomless, the exhalation of a depth you cannot measure. The waves are low and long and unhurried, rolling slowly southward in the dark, and far below you a pair of flying fish break the surface for a moment, silver darts catching what little light remains, before disappearing back into the quiet. The silence here is immense. It has been here long before you arrived, and it will remain long after you are gone, larger than any ship that has ever crossed it, larger than any story that has ever been told about it. Tonight we are going to drift slowly through one of the most famous and most misunderstood places on the face of the earth, the Bermuda Triangle, that broad and loosely defined stretch of ocean in the western North Atlantic that has gathered around itself more mystery, more legend, and more misremembering than almost any other patch of water on the planet. We will not rush. We will let the facts settle alongside the stories, and we will watch, with calm and curious eyes, as the truth and the myth sit quietly beside each other in the dark. You do not need to hold on to anything tonight. Let your breathing slow now, and let the sea carry you gently forward through everything there is to know about this particular piece of the world. The shape is roughly triangular, though no official body has ever formally defined it, no government has drawn its borders on any navigational chart, no authority has marked it on any nautical map that sailors are expected to consult. What people generally mean when they say the Bermuda Triangle is the area bounded by 3 points, the island of Bermuda to the north, Miami on the Florida coast to the west, and San Juan in Puerto Rico to the southeast. That triangle, if you were to draw it with a careful hand, would cover somewhere between 500,000 and 1.5 million square miles of open ocean, depending on how generously you chose to draw the lines. It is a large piece of the world. It is also one of the most heavily traveled stretches of water on Earth, crossed daily by cargo ships, cruise liners, private sailboats, military vessels, and commercial aircraft without incident or drama, without loss, without anything unusual at all. Tonight alone, as you drift here in the quiet, ships are moving through this water in every direction, lights blinking on their masts, engines turning slowly in the warm Atlantic dark, crews eating dinner in steel-walled galleys and watching the radar screens and feeling nothing in particular about where they are. The name itself, the Bermuda Triangle, did not exist until 1964, when a writer named Vincent Gaddis used it in an article for a pulp magazine called Argosy. But the idea that this particular piece of ocean was somehow strange, somehow dangerous, somehow more prone to swallowing ships and aircraft than other places, that idea is a little older, though not by very much. Its true birth, as a concept, can be traced to a single article published in September of 1950, written by a journalist named Edward Jones for the Associated Press. It was a short piece, barely 5 paragraphs, noting that a surprising number of ships and planes had disappeared in the area between Florida and Bermuda in recent years. It was not a sensational article. Jones did not use the word mystery. He simply noted what appeared to be a pattern and left it at that, a modest observation, a seed dropped into the fertile soil of public imagination, where it would germinate slowly for 2 decades before blooming into something far larger than Jones had intended. Let the water hold you now. The surface is dark and warm in these latitudes, warmer than you might expect this far from shore, warmer than the open Atlantic further north or further south. The Gulf Stream runs through here, that great river within the ocean, carrying heat northward from the tropics, keeping the water a deep and almost luminous blue even in winter, even at night. Beneath you, as you float in this imagined space, the ocean floor drops away into geological drama, the Blake Plateau, the Puerto Rico Trench, the deepest point in the Atlantic Ocean, where the water descends more than 27,000 feet, almost 5 miles straight down into the earth, into a darkness that light has never touched and never will. Down there, in that permanent black cold, creatures live that we have barely named, that we have seen only in photographs taken by unmanned submarines moving through the dark on their own slow errands. The fish that live at those depths carry their own light, tiny blue-white points of bioluminescence drifting through the black like stars in a private sky. But back to the surface. Back to the stories that gathered there in the years after Jones's modest article. The tale that truly ignited public imagination did not appear until 1974, when a writer named Charles Berlitz published a book simply called The Bermuda Triangle. Berlitz was a gifted storyteller, the grandson of the founder of the famous language school, a man who had grown up speaking multiple languages and telling multiple kinds of stories, and his book was a masterwork of atmospheric accumulation, piling case upon case upon case, disappearance upon disappearance upon disappearance, until the reader felt the weight of so many losses pressing down on them like deep water pressing down on a diving suit. The book sold nearly 20 million copies worldwide. It was translated into dozens of languages. It was read by people in apartments in Tokyo and farmhouses in the American Midwest and suburban homes in the English Midlands, and everywhere it was read it left behind the same residue of unease, the feeling that somewhere in the warm waters of the Western Atlantic, something was happening that science could not explain and common sense could not account for. The cases Berlitz drew upon were real, that is worth saying clearly. The disappearances happened. The planes went missing. The ships were lost. What Berlitz did, with extraordinary skill and very little scruple, was arrange them in a way that implied a connection, a pattern, a force, something operating in that region of the Atlantic that operated nowhere else. He changed details. He omitted contrary evidence. He simplified complex accidents into clean mysteries. He moved coordinates to place losses inside the triangle when the actual locations were hundreds of miles outside it. He left out the endings of stories that had perfectly mundane explanations, the vessel found drifting but undamaged, the crew rescued 2 days later, the pilot who had simply landed at the wrong airport. He was, in short, doing what storytellers have always done, shaping the raw material of experience into a narrative that felt meaningful, even when the raw material did not cooperate with the meaning he wanted to make. Let your breathing settle here for a moment. You are drifting on warm dark water, and the stars above you are beginning to multiply, one here, two there, a handful near the southern horizon, and then suddenly dozens and dozens more as the sky deepens into true night and your eyes adjust to the dark. The Milky Way is beginning to show itself, a pale smear from south to north, luminous and diffuse, and beneath it the sea is very still. There is nothing frightening about this place. There is only the warmth of the water, the salt on the air, and the ancient patience of the sky. The ocean does not know that stories have been told about it. The ocean does not know anything. It simply is, as it has always been, going about its enormous slow business of current and tide and temperature, carrying its cargo of salt and life and sunken history through the dark. The most famous case in the Bermuda Triangle story is almost certainly that of Flight 19, 5 United States Navy Avenger torpedo bombers that took off from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale on December 5, 1945, for a routine training exercise and never returned. 14 men vanished along with the aircraft. A rescue plane sent to search for them also disappeared, killing all 13 men on board. 27 men, 6 aircraft, gone in a single afternoon. It is a genuine tragedy, one of the most baffling losses in the history of naval aviation, and it deserves to be treated with the seriousness that a genuine tragedy demands. The families of those men waited for them. The Navy searched for weeks. The silence that answered the search was total. The details, when you sit with them carefully, are both more and less mysterious than the legend suggests. The flight leader that afternoon was Lieutenant Charles Taylor, an experienced pilot who had logged more than 2,000 hours of flight time. He was, however, unfamiliar with the specific area. He had recently transferred to Fort Lauderdale from Miami and had not yet flown the training routes around the Bahamas that his students had come to know well. Crucially, Taylor had left his personal wristwatch at home that morning, a small and seemingly trivial fact that would matter as the afternoon wore on and the sky darkened. The compasses on the aircraft, both Taylor's own and those of at least one other plane, were reported to be malfunctioning, though how severely and on how many of the 5 aircraft is still debated by aviation historians who have pored over the transcripts of the radio transmissions that afternoon. Taylor became convinced, for reasons that remain unclear even now, that the flight had drifted over the Florida Keys rather than over the Bahamas, and he turned the formation eastward to correct what he believed was an error. He was correcting in the wrong direction, moving the flight further and further out to sea, further from land, further from fuel, further into the growing dark of a December evening. The last radio transmissions from Taylor and from some of the other pilots indicate men who are confused about their position, who cannot see the sun, who are flying into increasing darkness with compasses they cannot fully trust and fuel gauges moving steadily toward empty. At some point the decision was made, or circumstances made it, to keep flying rather than to ditch in daylight while fuel and visibility still permitted a controlled landing on the water. By the time the decision could no longer be deferred, there was no light left and no fuel left and nothing left at all. The rescue aircraft that also disappeared that evening was a Martin Mariner, a large flying boat known by aircrews who flew it as the flying gas tank, on account of its tendency toward fuel vapor accumulation and its documented history of catastrophic explosion. A merchant ship in the area reported seeing a large ball of fire at the time and position where the mariner would have been flying. It is the most likely explanation, and it is not a mysterious one. It is an aircraft with a known and documented vulnerability, operating at night, in conditions where a spark or a leak could produce exactly the result that the merchant ship witnessed. None of this explains everything. None of this reduces the loss to something comfortable or easy. But it places the losses in the human world, the world of instrument failure and compass drift and winter darkness and one pilot's confusion, the world where aviation accidents actually happen, and where they have always happened, and where they will continue to happen as long as human beings climb into machines and fly them over open water. The night is very deep now. You can feel it in the way the water moves around you, slower, heavier, more deliberate, as though the sea itself has settled into something more permanent and restful. Let the sounds of the ocean come to you if they will, the low and rhythmic sighing of swells that have traveled 1,000 miles to be here, the faint whisper of wind across the surface, the occasional distant call of a seabird finding its way home in the dark. There is nothing urgent anywhere in this sound. There is nothing asking anything of you tonight. The triangle has attracted, over the decades since Berlitz's book, an extraordinary range of proposed explanations, some scientific, some speculative, some belonging firmly to the category of imagination unfettered by evidence. Alien abductions were suggested, and time warps, and undersea cities built by the survivors of Atlantis, and electromagnetic anomalies caused by crystal formations on the ocean floor, and portals to other dimensions. Each new theory arrived with its proponents and its paperbacks and its television documentaries, and each one offered, in its own way, the same comfort, the comfort of an explanation, of a cause that is commensurate with the scale of the loss. 27 men vanish in an afternoon, and we want to reach for a cause that is as vast and as strange as that vanishing feels. The ocean taking them because of ordinary bad weather and ordinary instrument failure and one pilot's ordinary confusion does not feel large enough. The universe, we feel, should have larger reasons for what it does. This feeling is deeply human. It is also, the record suggests, wrong. The USS Cyclops is another vessel whose loss has been absorbed into the Triangle's mythology and held there for more than a century now without resolution. The Cyclops was an enormous Navy collier, a coal-carrying ship, 542 feet long, displacing nearly 20,000 tons when fully loaded, that disappeared without trace in March of 1918 while sailing from Barbados northward to Baltimore with 309 men aboard and a cargo of manganese ore that had been loaded at a port in Brazil. No wreckage was ever found. No distress signal was ever received. The ship simply ceased to exist, as far as any record could determine, somewhere in the western Atlantic on a voyage that should have been routine, that had been made many times before, that offered no particular reason for concern when it departed Barbados in the second week of March. The loss of the Cyclops sits not entirely alone in the history of maritime disaster, and the Western Atlantic in 1918 was a dangerous place for reasons entirely unconnected to any supernatural force. German U-boats operated widely in those waters during the final year of the First World War, and while no German submarine was ever officially credited with sinking the Cyclops, and while German records, which were fairly thorough, do not mention such an attack, the possibility has never been entirely dismissed by naval historians. The ship was also known to be in poor mechanical condition, with one of its two engines completely disabled, leaving it slower and less maneuverable than it should have been at sea. It was reportedly overloaded, carrying more ore than its design capacity warranted, riding lower in the water than it should have been. The weather in March along that route can be brutal: sudden squalls, heavy swells, poor visibility, the tail ends of winter storms sweeping down from the North Atlantic. A ship in poor condition, overloaded, with one engine, running into heavy weather with no ability to radio a distress signal in the moments before catastrophe, this is a tragedy with a plausible shape, even if we cannot fill in all its specific details. Woodrow Wilson, who was president at the time, said the loss was one of the most baffling mysteries of the sea. He was right, and it remains so today, more than 100 years later, not because the ocean is conspiring against us, but because the sea keeps the things that fall into it with an absolute and unreasonable thoroughness. 5 miles of water between the surface and the floor itself vast and dark and uneven with ridges and canyons, and the currents that run through those depths moving in directions and at speeds we have only recently begun to map. A ship that goes down in a storm, in deep water, in bad weather, scatters its debris across miles of open sea, and most of that debris sinks quickly, and what does not sink is carried away on currents that may disperse it over thousands of miles before it comes to rest somewhere on a shoreline no one is watching. The absence of wreckage is not evidence of the supernatural. It is evidence of the sea. What is remarkable, when you begin to examine the cases carefully and honestly, is not how mysterious the losses are but how ordinary their likely explanations turn out to be when subjected to serious examination. In 1975, a librarian and skeptic named Lawrence David Cush published a book called The Bermuda Triangle Mystery, Solved, which did something that should have been done much earlier and that required not special scientific knowledge but only a willingness to go back to the original sources. He read the Lloyd's of London insurance records, which are among the most thorough maritime records in the world. He examined the United States Coast Guard logs from the relevant years. He checked the weather reports for the exact days and locations in question. He read the newspaper accounts published at the time of each incident, before the mythology had a chance to crystallize around the events and harden into something resistant to fact. What he found, case by case, was that the losses Berlitz had presented as mysterious were, in most instances, not mysterious at all when the full record was consulted rather than the edited version. Some of the losses Berlitz described had never occurred. Some had occurred but far outside the claimed boundaries of the triangle, in some cases hundreds of miles outside, in entirely different ocean conditions. Some had perfectly documented explanations that Berlitz had simply not included in his account, the ship that was listed as mysteriously missing but that, according to Lloyd's records, had been found a week later and towed to port, the aircraft that Berlitz described as vanishing without a trace but that, according to Coast Guard logs, had sent a distress signal and been found exactly where the signal indicated it would be found. Cush's conclusion was direct and unambiguous: the Bermuda Triangle mystery, as a mystery, does not exist. It was manufactured, not out of nothing, because the losses were real, but manufactured in the sense that the pattern, the force, the implied supernatural cause were all projections of the storyteller rather than properties of the ocean itself. Let your breathing settle here for a while. The water is warm beneath you and the stars are very steady overhead, not twinkling much tonight because the air is calm and clear, the atmosphere not disturbing the light as it comes down from those enormous distances. There is Orion rising in the east, that familiar arrangement of bright points that human beings have been navigating by for as long as human beings have been navigating, the 3 stars of his belt in their perfect diagonal line, the nebula in his sword that a telescope reveals as a cloud of gas and new stars forming in the slow and patient way that stars form, over millions of years, without any urgency at all. The night sky here over the Atlantic is darker than you might be accustomed to, further from the light pollution of cities, and in that extra darkness a whole additional layer of stars becomes visible, fainter ones, more distant ones, the light from further away. The sky is very full tonight. And yet the triangle persists in the imagination, even for people who know perfectly well that the statistics do not support it, that the insurance records do not support it, that the meteorology and the aviation history do not support it. Let it rest in its corner of the mind for a moment without being argued out of it. Because there is something genuine in the human impulse that created it, something that is not about deception or credulity but about a much older and more fundamental way of relating to the ocean. The sea has always been the place beyond the edge of the known world. Every culture that has ever lived near open water has populated that beyond with monsters, with gods, with zones of danger and zones of power that the wise and the humble are taught to approach with care. Here be dragons, the old maps used to say, and what they meant was not that there were dragons but that the cartographers had reached the edge of their knowledge and were drawing with honesty what they found there, the unknown, the uncharted, the genuinely other. The Bermuda Triangle is simply the 20th century version of those stories, stripped of its serpents and sea gods, dressed in the language of naval reports and aviation logs and Lloyd's insurance records, but fundamentally the same expression of the same ancient feeling. We look at the ocean and we know, in some deep and wordless place, that it does not care about us. It has no opinion about us. It would receive our bodies, if we fell into it, with exactly the same calm indifference with which it receives rain, and fish, and the slow accumulation of sediment falling from its surface over geological time. The Bermuda Triangle is a way of giving that indifference a shape, a location, a name, a way of saying that there is one particular piece of ocean where the indifference is concentrated, where the danger is specific and located, so that the rest of the ocean can feel, by contrast, a little safer, a little more knowable. There is one aspect of this stretch of ocean that does brush, genuinely, against the edge of the unusual, not the supernatural, but the geophysical, the measurable, the real. The Western Atlantic, and particularly the area of the Triangle, has historically been one of the regions of the world where magnetic north and true north align, where a compass needle points in the same direction as the geographic North Pole rather than at an angle to it. This alignment is called a zero-agonic line, and it shifts over centuries as the magnetic poles migrate, but historically the area around the triangle has sat near it. Early navigators who failed to account for the difference between magnetic and true north could find their charts misleading them in ways that compounded over long distances, producing navigational errors that would have been invisible on short voyages but devastating on longer ones. Whether this contributed meaningfully to historical losses in the triangle is genuinely uncertain and genuinely debated. But it is a real property of this piece of the Earth's magnetic field, and it is the kind of real property that could, in the era before electronic navigation, have made this water slightly more treacherous than water elsewhere, not because of mystery, but because of physics. There are also, in the waters of the Western Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, documented deposits of methane hydrates on the ocean floor, are ice-like crystalline formations of water and methane gas that exist under high pressure and low temperature in the deep sediments of certain continental shelves. Under certain geological conditions, shifts in temperature, changes in pressure, earthquakes, the gradual destabilization of the surrounding sediment, these deposits can release enormous quantities of methane gas into the water above them, creating what are called blowouts. When a large methane blowout occurs, the gas rising through the water column can lower the density of the water so dramatically and so suddenly that a ship floating above it loses its buoyancy in a matter of seconds and sinks almost instantly, without listing, without capsizing in the ordinary sense, without any warning or any surface debris of the kind that would normally mark a sinking. There is a hypothesis, not universally accepted among marine geologists, but scientifically plausible and taken seriously enough to have been the subject of peer-reviewed research, that such eruptions may have caused some of the unexplained and debris-free sinkings in the Atlantic over the centuries. The evidence is not definitive. The science is not settled. But it sits comfortably in the category of genuine natural explanation, not a monster, not a force, just the geology of a continental shelf doing what geology does, quietly and without malice and without any reference to the ships floating above it. You are floating very easily now. The water is warm all around you, the stars are out in their full numbers, and the Milky Way stretches from the southern horizon northward in a long pale arc, luminous and slow, that old river of light that our ancestors navigated by and named and told stories about when there was nothing else to do on a dark ocean night but watch the sky and wonder. The sea beneath you is not dangerous tonight. It is simply present, as it has always been, vast and old and completely indifferent to the small warm creature drifting on its surface, half asleep already, letting the warmth of the water come up through the skin and into the body and slow everything down. Bermuda itself, the northernmost point of the triangle, is a remarkable place and deserves some attention in the quiet of this night. It is not one island but an archipelago of small islands and islets, about 21 square miles of dry land in total, sitting alone in the North Atlantic roughly 650 miles off the coast of North Carolina, further from any continental shore than any other inhabited island in the Atlantic, isolated enough that it developed its own distinct culture, its own architecture, its own ways of doing things that distinguish it from Britain, from which it was governed, and from the Americas, which surround it on three sides at a comfortable distance. The islands are made of limestone, the compressed skeletons of ancient coral reefs, white and pink, and the houses built on them are also made of limestone, also white and pale pink, with distinctive stepped roofs designed to channel rainwater into underground cisterns, because Bermuda has no fresh water springs and depends entirely on what the sky provides. How Bermuda came to be inhabited at all is a story of accident. A ship called the Sea Venture, carrying English colonists to Virginia in 1609 as part of the Third Great Supply Mission to the struggling Jamestown settlement, was driven off course by a hurricane and wrecked on the reef surrounding Bermuda. The survivors found the islands unexpectedly hospitable, turtles to eat, cedar trees to build with, fresh water catchable from rain, and a climate mild enough to sustain a human settlement indefinitely. Within 2 years, 2 small ships had been built from the cedar of the island, and most of the survivors sailed on to Virginia, arriving to find Jamestown in desperate straits. Some remained behind in Bermuda, and from those few who stayed, a permanent colony grew. Shakespeare is thought to have heard of the wreck of the Sea Venture and woven something of its story into The Tempest, written around 1610 or 1611, making Bermuda, in a way, one of the inspirations for Prospero's Island, for Ariel, for Caliban, for the whole mythology of a magical island rising from the sea. The water around Bermuda is famous among divers and marine biologists for its clarity, its warmth, and the extraordinary density and variety of its marine life. The coral reefs that fringe the islands are the northernmost coral reefs in the Atlantic Ocean, kept alive at this unusually high latitude by the warmth of the Gulf Stream, and they support communities of fish and invertebrates and other creatures so rich and various that they read like an index of tropical ocean life, parrotfish grazing on coral with their fused, beak-like teeth, leaving white plumes of coral sand drifting in the water behind them, queen angelfish moving through the reef with the particular unhurried dignity of creatures that know they are beautiful, sea turtles rising slowly from the depths to breathe, their ancient faces breaking the surface with an expression of complete serenity, then sinking again, disappearing back into the blue. Ships have been wrecked on those reefs for 500 years and more, and the wrecks themselves have become part of the reef now, encrusted with coral, colonized by sponges, inhabited by fish that move in and out of portholes and companionways as calmly as if they were navigating the corridors of a house they had always owned. The sea returns things to itself, slowly and completely. Let your breathing slow down even further now. Let it find its own depth, its own rhythm, the rhythm it falls into when you are not thinking about breathing at all, slow and low and easy, the rhythm of someone who has already let go of the day and is only a little way from sleep. The water is holding you perfectly. The warmth of the Gulf Stream is coming up through it from below, and the warmth of a full night sky is pressing gently down from above, and you are suspended between them in a temperature that asks nothing of you, that makes no demand on your body to regulate itself, that simply allows you to be still. The pilots of the aircraft that disappeared in the Triangle, those we can know something about, through their radio transmissions and their flight logs and the careful testimony of those who trained and flew with them, were, in almost every case, competent and experienced people doing difficult work under conditions that were considerably less forgiving than they appear in retrospect. Aviation in the 1940s was still in a remarkably early stage of its development, still learning the precise limits of its instruments and its weather forecasting technology and its pilot training protocols. The compasses of the era were sensitive and sometimes unreliable instruments, easily disturbed by the magnetic fields of the aircraft themselves, by the vibration of powerful engines running nearby, by the proximity of metal structures and cargo. Navigation over open ocean without visual landmarks was genuinely difficult, genuinely a matter of maintaining a heading, tracking elapsed time, estimating wind drift, and accepting that your calculated position was only an approximation that could have accumulated significant error over the course of a long flight. And the Atlantic weather, always and always the weather, which is the true and unglamorous explanation for the great majority of maritime and aviation disasters in every ocean on Earth. The western Atlantic in winter is not mild. Cold fronts from North America sweep across it with extraordinary speed and ferocity, turning a calm and sunny afternoon into a confused and violent night in a matter of a very few hours. The Coast Guard accident reports from the 40s and 50s, when so many of the famous triangle losses occurred, describe over and over again the same pattern: rapidly deteriorating weather, poor or zero visibility, disoriented pilots or confused navigators working with instruments that were functioning at the edge of their accuracy, and then silence on the radio, and then days or weeks of searching that found, in some cases, a small amount of debris, and in other cases found nothing at all. The ocean is very large. It is very deep. It keeps the things that fall into it with a completeness that no human search effort has ever been able to fully overcome. There is a particular thing worth sitting with here, in the quiet of this night, over this warm dark water, the recognition that the ocean has claimed ships and aircraft and people in every ocean on Earth, in every era of navigation, for exactly the same reasons that apply to the Bermuda Triangle. The waters off Japan have claimed ships. The waters off the Horn of Africa have claimed ships. The North Atlantic shipping lanes have claimed ships in numbers that dwarf anything that can be specifically attributed to the Triangle, particularly in the two world wars, when the North Atlantic was a killing ground for submarines and storms and cold and the accumulated terrible weight of war. The Bermuda Triangle is not unusual in its losses. It is unusual only in the story that was told about it, and in the way that story found its audience and held it. The night has reached its fullness now. The stars are at their highest and their brightest, and the sea below them is at its darkest and its most still. The Florida coast, the western point of the triangle, is a remarkable thing to contemplate from the water. It is one of the flattest and lowest lying pieces of land on Earth, barely rising from sea level, barely distinguishable from the ocean itself at certain points along its southern reaches, where the Everglades blend into Florida Bay in a way that makes the boundary between land and water genuinely uncertain. From a ship at sea, the Florida coast announces itself not with cliffs or hills but with a gradual lightening of the sky at night, the glow of Miami visible for miles before the shore itself becomes visible, the city sending its light upward into the atmosphere in a soft orange dome that early pilots used as a navigational landmark before electronic navigation made such things less necessary. The Keys stretch southward from the tip of Florida in a long curved arc of small coral islands, barely above the waterline, fringed by reefs that have wrecked ships since the first Spanish galleons attempted to navigate the Florida Straits in the 1500s. The reef there is not a barrier reef set well back from open water but a fringing reef very close to the surface, invisible in certain light conditions, capable of tearing the bottom out of a ship that does not know precisely where it is. The Spanish established a whole industry of salvage operations along the Keys specifically because the wrecks were so frequent and so reliably full of recoverable cargo, an industry called wrecking, whose practitioners listened for the sound of waves breaking on coral and went out in the night toward that sound, knowing what it meant. The horizon in every direction is perfectly level, that long, unbroken line where the ocean and the sky meet, the line that sailors have been measuring and navigating by for as long as there have been sailors, the line that tells you the earth is round even when everything else in your immediate experience suggests it is flat. The curvature of the earth is visible from a ship at sea in a way it is visible almost nowhere else, in the way a distant ship appears hull down on the horizon, its mast visible before its deck, as if it is rising gradually from below the surface of a sphere. The early sailors who noticed this were seeing clearly. The earth is round, and the horizon is its proof, and somewhere beyond the horizon, in every direction, is more ocean and then eventually land and then more ocean and then more land and eventually, if you went far enough, you would come back to where you started. What the Bermuda Triangle ultimately gives us, if we are willing to accept it honestly, is not a mystery about the ocean but a kind of mirror, a reflection of ourselves, of our desire for explanation and pattern and meaning in places where the evidence does not quite support the meaning we are reaching for. We are pattern-finding creatures, constitutionally, in a way that precedes language and precedes culture and is woven into the structure of the nervous system itself. We cannot help finding patterns. It is the same quality that allowed our ancestors to look at random arrangements of stars and sea bears and hunters and queens and scorpions, to impose a human narrative on an inhuman sky. It is the same quality that led early naturalists to look at fossils embedded in stone and understand, gradually and haltingly, that the earth had a history far longer and stranger than anything their traditions had imagined. Pattern finding is not a weakness. It is one of the great engines of human intelligence and human survival. It simply requires, occasionally, the corrective of honest and careful examination, the willingness to go back to the actual records, to the weather reports and the Lloyd's registers and the Coast Guard logs, to ask whether the pattern is really there or whether we have projected it onto the noise of ordinary tragedy. And there is something worth dwelling on, in this quiet and this dark, the recognition that ordinary tragedy is itself profound and real and deserving of attention. The men of Flight 19 did not disappear because of a supernatural force operating in a particular triangle of ocean. They disappeared because of a set of circumstances that converged on a December afternoon in 1945 in ways that no one could fully have predicted or prevented. A pilot who was unfamiliar with the area, compasses that were not reliable, a sky that darkened faster than expected, decisions made under pressure with incomplete information, and the ocean waiting below with its ancient patience and its total indifference. Charles Taylor, confused and flying into the dark over water that looked the same in every direction, made decisions that seemed reasonable to him in the moment and that turned out, in the event, to be fatal. The men who flew with him trusted their flight leader, as you trust the person at the front of the formation, and they followed him, and they are gone. That is not a lesser story than the supernatural version. In many ways it is a greater one, because it is true, and because it is human, and because it speaks to the way that small errors can compound in the dark into consequences that no one intended and no one could undo. The sea accepts all of this without comment. It has received the wrecks and the wreckage and the bodies and the debris of 1,000 years of human navigation through these waters, and it has taken all of it down into its dark and kept it with equal patience and equal silence. The Spanish galleons loaded with New World gold that went down in the hurricanes of the 16th and 17th centuries, scattered across the shallow banks of the Bahamas and the Florida Straits. The ships that carried enslaved people across this same water for 300 years, and those that sank in storms with everyone aboard, and those that crossed safely and delivered their terrible cargo, all of them received by the same indifferent water in the same way. The warships that went down in 2 world wars, the cargo vessels, the tankers, the destroyers, the submarines. The single-handed sailors who set out from Europe with a small boat and a sextant and the stars, some of whom arrived in the Caribbean after weeks alone on the ocean, and some of whom did not arrive anywhere. All of them here, in this water, in this dark, in the permanent and patient quiet of the deep. Let that thought settle very gently around you now. Not as a sad thought, as a true one. As a thought that has a particular kind of weight that is also, somehow, a kind of comfort. Every body of water on this planet is full of human history, of human aspiration and human loss. Every coastline has its stories of arrival and departure. The sea has always been the great connector, the road between worlds, the thing that separated peoples and also, over and over, brought them together. The Atlantic particularly has been the stage for so much of the last 500 years of human history, has carried so many ambitions and disasters and hopes, that to stand on any shore of it and look outward is to feel the weight of all that movement and all those crossings pressing back from the horizon. The Bermuda Triangle is a small piece of that water. Its story is mostly a story about us, about what we see when we look at the ocean, about what we need to feel when we contemplate the power of something so much larger than ourselves. There are no mysteries that the sea holds by intention. The ocean does not hide things. It simply is what it is, vast and old and dark at its depth and full of pressure and salt and life and geology and the slow and enormous circulation of water that has been circulating since long before any living thing existed on this planet to observe or name it. When a ship is lost on the sea, the ocean does not mark the occasion. When a plane descends into it, the surface closes over in a matter of seconds and becomes what it was before, flat and dark, and moving with the same long swells that were moving through it 1,000 years ago. There is something peaceful in that continuity. Let it be peaceful. The ocean was here before the first story was told about it and will be here after the last story has been forgotten. You are a small warm creature floating on a very large ocean on a very quiet night, and the stars overhead are the same stars that sailors have used to navigate these waters for as long as sailors have crossed them, and you are perfectly safe, and you are perfectly held. Let your body go now. Let it sink a little deeper into the warmth of whatever surface is holding you, a mattress, pillow, blanket, the familiar and particular comfort of wherever you are sleeping tonight. Your arms are heavy. Your legs are heavy. The muscles of your face have given up their last small tensions, and your expression has gone calm and neutral and still, the expression of someone who has already let go of the day and begun the long, easy slide toward sleep. The Bermuda Triangle is out there somewhere in the dark, across the ocean, warm and unremarkable, crossed tonight by ships that will arrive where they are going. The mystery was never in the water. It was in us, in our ancient and irrepressible need to make the sea into something with a story, something with intention, something that notices us enough to mean us harm. The ocean is just the sea tonight. It asks nothing. It holds everything. Somewhere above the dark water, a frigate bird is still flying, those great black birds with wingspans wider than a man is tall, built to stay aloft for days at a time over open ocean, sleeping on the wing, navigating by some combination of star and wind and magnetic sense that we have not fully mapped. It circles very high above the water in long slow spirals, almost invisible against the dark sky, completely at home in this enormous open space, in the warm Atlantic night, in the silence that is so complete it becomes a kind of sound itself, the sound of the world breathing slowly and evenly, in and out, the way it has always breathed. Sleep. The water is warm. The stars are keeping their old and patient watch. The frigate bird is circling in the dark above an ocean that is exactly what it has always been, a world within a world, deep and old and full of its own dark life, conducting its enormous business without reference to us or our stories or our need to make it mysterious. Let the warmth of the water come through you now, and the weight of your body settle fully into the surface beneath you, and all the small accumulated tensions of the day release, one by one, as your breathing slows and deepens. The stars. The warm dark water. The long slow breathing of the sea. Let go.